Question 1, it's estimated that humans begin REM sleep 90 minutes after falling asleep. Based on this estimate, how many seconds after falling asleep do humans begin REM sleep? So the question is basically how many seconds are there in 90 minutes? So obviously all you got to do is multiply by 60. The formal way to do this is knowing that there are 60 seconds in 1 minute. You set up a conversion factor, 60 seconds divided by 1 minute. Why do I put the minutes in the bottom? Because the units cancel out. And then 90 times 60 is obviously going to be 5,400, and you're left with seconds. The reason I point that out is because if the problem is more complicated, I want you to know how to do it the formal way. If you were going in reverse, 5,400, or let's say 500 seconds, because that's what I wrote, then you want to know how many minutes that is. Put 1 minute on the top, 60 seconds on the bottom, and then you're really just dividing 500 divided by 60, and you'll get the answer that way. Question 2, function g is defined by g of x equals 4x minus 2. What is the value of g of negative 3? So this is kind of just like plug and play. So g of negative 3 means negative 3 is in for x. 4 times negative 3 minus 2. 4 times negative 3 is negative 12 minus 2 equals negative 14. And so D is the answer. Question 3, the length of line segment BC is 2 times the length of line segment AB. Which equation represents the situation? So before we look at it, just translating, BC equals 2 times AB. And so if we're translating that based on the information, then BC we know is 20 equals 2 times AB, which is x, and that gets us to choice D. Question 4, 2 people sweep the floor. The table gives their sweeping rates in yards per square minute, or yards squared per minute. If each person sweeps the floor for 5 minutes, how much greater of an area does Eric sweep than Jeremy? So this is like question 1, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to use the conversion factors. I'm just going to multiply each of these by 5. That gives us 60 in the top, and 16 times 5 is going to be 80. And so they want to know the difference. So Eric sweeps 20 more square yards than Jeremy, and so A is going to be the answer. And notice this works because if you've got 12 yards per minute, you're multiplying by 5 minutes. The minutes cancel out, but just conceptually you can think in your mind, if you're doing 12 yards per minute and you do 5 minutes, you're obviously going to multiply 12 times 5. Question 5, which is equivalent to this? So really just be very careful when you multiply this out. So x to the 4th times 3x squared is going to be 3x to the 6th. You add the exponents. 1 times 9, this is going to be 9x to the 5th. Add the exponents again, minus 8 times x to the 4th is just 8x to the 4th. So all that means is choice B is the answer. Question 6, these are starting off pretty easy. The function is defined by f of x equals 2x minus 4. What is the y-intercept of the graph in the xy plane? So the y-intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis, and at that point x is 0. So formally, this is what we're figuring out. We're figuring out what is f of 0. So that's 2 times 0 minus 4. Obviously that's 0 minus 4, and so that becomes negative 4. So if we say that f of 0 equals negative 4, that translates to the ordered pair 0, comma negative 4, and that's the y-intercept, and so the choice is going to be D. Or you could have just looked at this up here and said, hey, I know that's equal y mx plus b, and therefore negative 4 is the y-intercept, and boom, you would have gotten you straight to choice D, whatever is easier for you guys. Question 7, the table summarizes the number of public schools in 2 California counties in 2017. So notice this is one of those tables where they give you the total going down and the total going to the right, so it's nice. A public middle school will be selected at random from the 2 counties. What is the probability to the nearest 100th of selecting a school in San Diego County? So middle school is this row, and selecting San Diego is 165 out of the total. They've already done that for us. So on your calculator, you're basically just doing 165 over 587, and you should have gotten 0.281, and to the nearest hundredth, obviously we round down and it becomes 0.28. Question 8, a museum built a scale model of the solar system throughout its city where 1 mile in the model represents an actual distance of 400 million miles. The model of the sun is x miles away from the model of the earth. Which expression represents the actual distance in miles between the sun and the earth? So this is an example where it does pay to convert this the formal way, just in case this gets confusing. So we know that the sun is x miles, and on the model, given that a model has a 0, I'm going to put sub-0. Now what's our equivalent? We know that 1 mile on the model equals 400 million actual miles. So what I'm going to do is I want to figure out how many actual miles this is. I'm going to put 400 million real miles up at the top, and that's equal to 1 mile on the model, sub-0. And so basically, notice what happens. The units cancel out. You multiply x times 400 million. That becomes 400 million x, and the units left over are actual miles. And so that's why the actual distance, even though we don't know what x is going to be choice A. You could have also picked a number for x, and maybe it would have made more sense intuitively in your mind. Just multiply that number by 400 million. But I did want to show you the formal way of doing it. Question 9, the list shown gives the heights of 6 10-year-old children in a group. It's kind of nice because they put it in order for us. A 7th child with a height of 60 inches will be added to the group. Which of the following correctly describes how the mean and the median will change when the 7th child is added? So obviously we know the mean, which is the average, is going to go up because this kid is 60 inches or 5 feet tall. So let's eliminate anything that says the mean is not going to go up. Choice A, mean and median will increase. That's okay. B is out, and D is out because they both say the median or the mean will decrease. Now what's going to happen to the median? All right, so originally in this list that has 6 elements, the median is going to be right in the middle, and so it's the average of the two middle. So the original median obviously is going to be 54. Now what happens when we add this extra 60? Now there are 7, and so the new median is the one that's right in the middle, which is this 54, because you've got 3 here and 3 there. So the median, notice, does not change. And so that's why the answer is going to be choice C. 10 and 11 refer to this graph. Let's read it. In a certain school district, 36 high school students were selected at random for a study on internet use and offline reading habits. During October, each student reported the average amount of time to the nearest half hour spent reading offline on Saturdays, and the average amount of time to the nearest half hour spent using the internet on Saturdays. So reading versus the internet. The scatterplot shows the times recorded by the students, and a line of best fit is shown. So we've got time spent using the internet here, time spent reading offline here, and wow, these numbers are kind of all over the place, but there is sort of an inverse relationship, which makes sense because obviously the more time you spend on the internet, the less time you're going to get to spend reading offline. So let's look at the questions. 10. The line of best fit underestimates one student's reported average time spent using the internet on Saturdays by more than 2 hours. For how many hours did the student report reading offline? So first we got to find this student. So if it said that the line underestimated the student's internet time, we're looking for any of these dots that are above the line. So let's take this student, for example. This guy spent 4 hours on the internet, but the line estimates that he spent about 3 hours. So this is an underestimate of about 1 hour. So we need to find a dot that's a far greater distance from the line, and obviously that's going to be this one up here, because the actual amount of time this student spent using the internet was 5 hours, and the line estimates it to be about somewhere between 2.5 to 3. So that's way more than 2 hours. Now the question is asking how many hours did this person spend reading offline? So we just have to go straight down, and obviously This person spent 1.5 hours reading offline. So the answer is going to be B. Question 11, according to the line of best fit, if a student spends an average of 1.25 hours reading offline, which of the following is the best estimate of the time the student would be expected to spend using the internet? So 1.25 hours reading is right about here. And so we go straight up and we're right here on the line. So if this student, according to the line, were spending 1.5 hours reading, then they'd be spending somewhere between 2.5 and 3, maybe 2.75 hours on the internet. So obviously the answer is going to be C. So it's basically just find the point on the graph, and they're just testing to see that you know how to read it. Question 12, line K is defined by that equation. Line J is parallel to line K. What is the slope of line J? So we know this is in y equals mx plus b form. The slope of line K is -1. And if J is parallel lines have the same slope. So it's also going to be -1. Remember, because parallel lines never intersect. Question 13, for a survey, students were assigned to either group R or group V. Combined, the students in both groups answered a total of 17 questions. Of these, a total of 9 questions were answered by students in group V. The equation describes the situation where R represents the number of questions answered by each student in group R. Which of the following is the best interpretation of 4R in this context? So this is fairly easy. What they want you to see is that the equation is listing the total number of questions. So 4R plus 9 equals 17. So 17 is the total questions, 9 is the questions answered by group V. 4R, therefore, has to be the number of questions answered in group R. The reason this might be somewhat confusing is because they're concealing the fact that 4R talks about the number of questions each student answered, but here it's harder, you can't really see the number of questions that each student in group V answered. So it would have to be something like maybe 1V. So let's say there were 9 people in group V and they each answered 1 question. That's what it would look like. Or it could have said something like this: 4R plus 3V equals 17. And this would mean that each person in group V answered 3 questions, each person in group R answered 4 questions. So regardless, they kind of just want you to be able to read the equation, and C is the answer. Question 14, how many solutions does the equation blah 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 have? Now your first instinct might be to divide the whole equation by x plus 1 on both sides. I would not do that, because if you're dividing both sides by x plus 1, you have to assume that x is not equal to -1. Because if x were equal to -1, then you'd be dividing by 0, which obviously you can't do. So the easier way to do this is really just multiply out the left side. That becomes 5x plus 5 equals 5x plus 5. And then automatically you should see that if the left and the right are exactly the same, you've got infinitely many solutions. Why? Because if you subtract everything out, subtract 5 on both sides, you're left with 5x equals 5x. Divide by 5, x equals x. And you can even go further, subtract x on both sides, 0 equals 0. So what this shows is that no matter what value you plug in for x, at the end of the day, you're always going to get 0 equals 0, which is absolutely true. And intuitively that should make sense, because hey, if you've got the same equation on both sides, then obviously it doesn't matter what you plug in for x. It's always going to be equal to itself. And by the way, on the SAT, given that this is a standard form that they like, if it said 5x plus 5 and 5x plus 4, this would be an equation that had no solutions, because if you subtract 5x from both sides, you get 5 equals 4, which shows that no matter what value of x you put in, 5 is never equal to 4. So that would have no solutions. If it said something like 5x plus 5 equals 3x plus 4, then this is a standard equation, because notice what happens. Subtract 5 on both sides, you get 5x equals 3x minus 1. Subtract 3x, you get 2x equals -1. And divide both sides by 2, you get x equals -1/2. So this example has one solution, which is what you generally see in school. This example has no solutions, and this example has infinite solutions. So that's just kind of a the 3 general cases that you'll see. Question 15, the table shows the results of a survey on the average amount of money, D, in dollars, consumers would be willing to spend on a product and their corresponding age, A, in years. Which equation could represent this linear relationship? So the fact that they're calling it linear helps us out because you'll notice that all of these are in y equals mx plus b form. So we really don't know what the y-intercept is. Notice they all have different slopes except for C and D. So probably the easiest thing to do is calculate the slope real quickly. I'm going to do that using these two. So slope is change in y over change in x. So given that this is the y, it's going to be 42 minus 36 over 25 minus 28. And on the top, we get 6. On the bottom, we get -3. And so the slope is going to be equal to -2. That automatically tells us B is out, C is out, D is out, and A has to be the right answer. What's actually interesting about this equation is if you were to sort of draw this out, if the y-intercept is 92, then that would be saying like babies or people who are 0 years old would be willing to spend $92. So obviously they probably have to restrict this graph by saying, oh, this only applies from ages, I don't know, maybe 20 to 30, because if you go out to the extremes, then it's obviously not going to work. 16, if x is a solution to the given equation, what is the value of x plus 1? So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking this is like 4a equals 6 plus 2a. If you saw it like that, you'd automatically know, why don't we just subtract the 2a on both sides? So we're left with 2 times x plus 1 equals 6. And then this just becomes straight algebra. X plus 1 equals 3. You divide by 2 on both sides. X equals 2. And therefore x plus 1 is going to be 3. You could have also multiplied it out, 4x plus 4 and 2x plus 2. You would have, I think it would have worked. A relatively easy problem. I'm surprised that it's number 16. Question 17, the initial number of bacteria in a population is 10,000. The bacteria in a population are observed to double every 12 hours. Which graph represents the number of bacteria in thousands? X hours after the initial observation. So notice all these graphs are increasing exponential. They are pretty precise because they map out the numbers. So the easiest way to do this is really just to pick some test points. So when X is 0 hours, we know we start out with 10,000. I'm just going to write a 10. So that's one coordinate. If it doubles every 12 hours, that means at 12 hours, it's going to be 20. At 24 hours, it's going to be 40. At 36 hours, it's going to be 80, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at the graph, hey, 24 is right here. That's at 40. That looks good. 48, we just have to do one more. That's going to be 160. 48, yeah, that looks about 160. So A so far looks like it's going to be good. I would check at 24 and 48 on all of these. Choice B, 24, it's a little bit low because right here, 24 is at 30. And then 48 is also pretty low. That's at 80. So B is out. For choice C at 24, yeah, too low. We're at 20. So that's going to be out. And choice D at 24, yeah, that looks like we're at about like 15. So choice A matches up closely with how this would work out. And if you were to write this out as an equation, it would be y equals, you start off with 10, it doubles. If X represents the hours and it doubles every 12 hours, you'd have to do X over 12, and that's how it would work. Question 18, we got 4 data sets on a box plot. It summarizes the data in each of 4 data sets. Which of the 4 has a range of 6? So remember that this part is the minimum value. This part is the maximum value. The middle is the median. We don't care about that. So to get the range, you're subtracting the max minus the minimum. So for data set A, the maximum here is about 4, and you're subtracting 1. So 4 minus 1 is 3. So the range is 3 here. Not going to work. You can go through each of them, but they make it nice because I can kind of just eyeball this. The last one, data set D, is going to be 9 minus 3. And that's exactly 6. So just visually looking at it, you can tell that D is going to be the answer right away. Question 19, a forest contains different species of trees. T is the total number of trees. H is the number of hickory trees. K is the number of oak trees. If a tree is selected at random from the forest, which expression represents the probability of selecting a tree that is neither hickory nor oak? So you could pick numbers for these if that makes your life easier. But the way that I thought of this first, if hickory and oak together is h plus k, right? And we want to write an expression that means the trees that are not h plus k. So if the total is t, then t minus h plus k is basically all the trees that are not h plus k. And then you want to put that over the total number of trees, which is going to be t. Notice they don't have that in any of the answer choices, because what they did is they distribute the negative sign up top. And that is kind of interesting because it makes it look less obvious. And so the answer is going to be B. But you can think of this conceptually also, right? Because if you start off with the total, you subtract out the hickory trees, and then you subtract out the, what is K? The oak trees. Yeah, you're going to be left with the trees that are not hickory and not oak. So whichever one was kind of more intuitive to you guys, question, equation, expression 1 or 2, it doesn't really matter. Or you could have picked numbers and then just, worked out and see which one made sense. Question 20, in the xy plane, the quadrants are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. The graph of that, where h and k are positive constants, is a parabola. In which quadrant is the vertex of the parabola? So you should have memorized your equation for a parabola, y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. Written exactly like that, the vertex is h comma k. You have to pay attention to the signs because you're subtracting h, and that means your vertex is that number, and you're adding k. So in this particular case, since we're adding k instead of subtracting it, we know the vertex is going to be negative h. Sorry, since we're adding h and not subtracting it. K we're adding just like, the form that we memorized. So that's going to be your vertex. And this still follows the same form because, by the way, how do you get x plus h plus k? It's really x minus negative h squared plus k. So notice that we're still following the same original form of the parabola. Instead of subtracting a positive h, we're subtracting a negative h. That's why the coordinate of the vertex is negative h comma k, which puts us negative, positive in the second quadrant. And also, by the way, since this is negative, it's going to open downward. And so but they don't care about that. The vertex is in quadrant 2. So if you memorize your equation of the parabola, this is pretty easy stuff. Question 21. At the beginning of the day, there were 500 items for sale in a store. The number of items for sale at the end of the day was R% less than the number at the beginning of the day. Which expression represents the number of items for sale at the end of the day? So if you're totally confused, you could just pick a number R. Like let's say there were 10% items less at the end of the day. Calculate what 90% of 500 is. Then plug your R into each answer choice and then see which one matches up with your number. That's a totally valid way of doing this. Notice also choices A and B are the same. So this is obviously a typo. Now I know some of you can probably just eyeball this and be like, oh, I automatically know that that's the answer. And if you can do that, great. I'll show you the way that I did it just so that it makes a little bit more sense. What I basically did was I said, all right, we're starting off with 500 and we're losing R% of 500. So to express R as a percent, notice we're doing fractions. So I put R over 100. And if it's R% of 500, then this expression represents what we're left with. Now notice though, it doesn't look like any of the choices. So given that all of them are multiplying something by 500, what I did was I factored out a 500. And so this becomes 1 minus R over 100. So we're getting a little closer. And notice that inside the parentheses, it's a single fraction. So what you want to do here is combine this using the least common denominator. So 1 is obviously 100 over 100 minus R over 100. And then if you combine this, it's 100 minus R over 100 all times 500. And so that's going to give us A or B. Their answer was choice A. So I know you can look at this, you can rationalize this in your head. If you're saying they lost R%, so that means 100 minus R over 100 is the percent that's left, and that's out of 500, which is why they're multiplying it by 500. So however you want to do this, whatever's fastest and whatever's easiest. Choice C, by the way, R over 100 would be the percent that they actually sold out of 500, or the actual amount that they sold. Notice that choice D is not putting the R in terms of a percent. If you just say 100 minus R, you're just multiplying 500 by an arbitrary number. So choice D is going to be the most wrong. Question 22, the area in square inches of a certain right triangle is given by the equation, blah, blah, blah. B is one of the legs of the triangle. Which expression represents the length of the shortest leg? All right, so what I did was I basically drew a triangle, and it says B is the length of one of the legs. And if the area is 1/2 B times 2B, you know that area of the triangle is 1/2 base times height. So if B is the base, and that's kind of the way I drew it, then 2B is obviously going to be the height. You could have flipped this triangle around, by the way, and just drew it like this. Doesn't really matter. B would be there, 2B would be there. Base and height can interchange, obviously. And so if they want to know the shortest leg, assuming B is a positive number and it's a length, then obviously B is going to be shorter than twice B. And so the shortest leg is going to be choice B. Question 23, scientists took 94 ice core sections from a glacier. Each section was in the shape of a right circular cylinder, had a length of 1 meter and a diameter of 0.1 meters. Which of the following is the closest to the total volume of the 94 sections? So you can draw a quick diagram of a cylinder, and it's going to be a right cylinder. So it kind of looks like that. And the diameter from here to here is 0.1. The length is 1. You should have memorized that the volume of a cylinder is, like I always say, the area of the circle multiplied by the length, because you're kind of bringing it into the third dimension. Let's first figure out the area, and then we can figure out the volume, and then we'll multiply it by 94 because we have 94 of these things. So given that the diameter is 0.1, I'm just going to write this out. That means the radius is going to be half of that, which is 0.05. The area of the circle is pi r squared, so 0.05 squared times pi. I just reversed that. And if you put in pi or 3.14, you're going to get something on your calculator like 0.00785. That's the area. And then we want to find the volume, which is, I'll just write the area times the length. So it's going to be 0.00785, obviously times 1, so that doesn't change. And so let's just multiply this number by 84, because if you want the volume of or 94 rather, when you do that on your calculator, you're going to get something like 0.7379. And did they tell you what to round it to? They don't even give the answer, the option. So obviously the closest one is going to be choice D, 0.7. Question 24, it says, in the figure GE and DH intersect at point F, which of the following additional statements is sufficient to prove that triangle DEF is similar to HGF? So just by looking at the answer choices, they've actually improved the language. There were some older tests where it was kind of ambiguous what it meant, because if you needed just one or just two or neither or both, the answers weren't really good. But I like to see that they've made an improvement on this. So what are they asking? They want to know, is the top triangle and the bottom triangle similar? To get similar triangles, you need to prove that two angles are congruent. So we already have one angle here because that's the vertical angle. The question is, are any of these angles congruent to each other? So let's see what we get. The length of DE is 1/3 the length of HG. So obviously the length is not actually going to necessarily affect the angle. And the reason that's not the case, by the way, is because you could just imagine, let's adjust the lengths the way they want. If you change the angle of, say, GH, you could, keep the verticals the same, and by moving GH any way we want, we can keep the lengths in the same way that we want, yet we can keep changing the angles, so that's not going to work. Number 2, DE is parallel to HG. So what happens if we do this? DE parallel to HG. Now we've got two parallel lines cut by two transversals. And remember, you guys should know this, when you cut two parallel lines, your alternate interior angles are going to be the same. So that would be angle E is going to be congruent to angle G, and then angle D over here is going to be congruent to angle H if DE and GH are parallel. So 2 would be sufficient to prove these triangles similar, 1 is not, and so therefore B is the right answer. Question 25, the scatter plot shows the relationship between the two variables x and y. A line of best fit is shown. Which data point has an actual y value that is 2 more than the y value predicted by the line? All right, so what does that mean? We're looking for a dot that's 2 above the line, because that would be 2 more than what's predicted. So very quickly, we look at the scale. Each single bar, vertically speaking, is worth 2 because it goes from like 0 to 4. So my first choice was to look up here. This is from 38 to 34. This is a distance of 4, not going to work. My next choice was right over here. This dot is on line 30, and the line predicts it to be on 28. So that's a value of 2 more than what the line predicted. And so they're asking, which data point is that? That's going to be 5, 30. And so D is the right answer. Question 26, a plant's height is 1.25 times its height from last week. What is the percent increase? So this is something the SAT just wants you to know automatically. If you multiply something by 1.25, then you're increasing it by 25%. If you're not convinced, I can show it mathematically. Let's pick any number, let's say 50, for example, and you multiply by 1.25. What are you actually multiplying 50 by? I'm going to split this and say 1 plus 0.25 times 50. And this really becomes 50 times 1 plus 50 times 0.25. So what does this show? You guys should know that if you multiply 50 times 0.25, that's 25% of 50. And if you add that to 50, therefore you're adding 25%, which is why it's choice D. 27, in a forest, white pine trees between 15 and 45 years old grew 36 to 48 inches each year. A 15-year-old white pine tree growing in the forest was 240 inches tall. Which of the following inequalities gives the possible values for the tree's height in inches at the end of its 45th year? So basically, we've got two possibilities. It's going to grow, the range is anywhere from 36 to 48. The time period is from its 15th year, because it's 15 years old, to its 45th year. So basically, it's growing for 38 years, or 30 years rather. So in the first situation, let's say it's going to grow 36 inches. That's going to be over a period of 30 years. The second situation is if it's growing 48 inches over a period of 30 years. You multiply those out, and you're going to get 1080 and 1440. It's kind of funny because that's the resolution of like most TVs or monitors, and this is the number of inches that they grow. And so basically, if they start off at 240, you kind of just have to add 240 plus 1080 and 240 plus 1440. That's going to get you 1320 and 1680. So this is the range of its new height at the end of its 45th year. And so that's why the answer is going to be choice D. Question 28, p% of x is 3. Which is x in terms of p? So you could pick numbers, I think, and then figure it out and see which one works. Mathematically, if you're saying p%, that's going to be p over 100. And p% of x, that means you multiply equals 3. Now they want to know what is x in terms of p, so just get x by itself. Multiply both sides by 100. We get px equals 300. divide by p, x equals 300 over p. And notice that the closest answer is going to be choice C, because 100 times 3 is going to be 300. And if you're picking numbers for this, you just have to make sure that this statement is true, because they're giving you a 3. So for example, if we want to say 200% of 1.5 is 3, that'll work, because obviously 3 is double 1.5. So then when you plug these numbers in, you're going to get a value that equals 1.5 when you plug in 200 for 3. So just to show you that real quick, it's going to be, I'll just use choice C. It's 100 times 3 divided by 200. And so that's 300 over 200 equals 1.5. And that's how you know you're right. By the way, when you pick numbers, if you find two answers where the numbers work, that means you pick numbers that give you a coincidence. So just pick another set of numbers and you should be able to find the right answer. But I think picking numbers takes a little bit longer than just doing it the real way. Just be comfortable with either one. Question 29, we've got a function. Which of the following equivalent forms of the given function f displays as the base or the coefficient the y-coordinate of the y-intercept of the graph in the xy plane? All right, so this looks like a hard problem, but it's actually really not. By the way, these are all exponential functions because x is in the exponent. I really don't know what these things look like. You really don't have to know what they look like. What you need to do is exactly what they say and not assume that you need any special knowledge for this. So what they want is, number one, they're telling us that these are all equivalent forms of the same function. So if we graphed all these, it should look exactly the same. What they want specifically is a function that displays the y-coordinate of the y-intercept in a very obvious form. The obvious forms are as the base or as the coefficient. So all we have to do is find out what the y-coordinate of the y-intercept is, and you do that by making x equal to 0. So that'd be like saying f of 0 equals 3 to the negative 2, 0 plus 1. And negative 2 times 1 is going to be 3 to the negative 2. This obviously becomes 1 over 3 squared, or 1/9. So we know that when x is 0, y is 1/9. And so that's going to be the y-intercept, 0, 1/9, 1/9. And they want to know which function displays the y-coordinate, 1/9, as a base or a coefficient. And the only one where we see 1/9 in the function, technically it's a coefficient here, is choice B. So that's all you really had to do. And the reason I take the time to explain this is because this is a sort of a new type of question on the SAT. We've seen this a few times. Question 30, two different store owners in a shopping center estimated the percentage of all visitors who wear eyeglasses. They selected a random sample of the shopping center visitors and recorded whether the visitors were wearing eyeglasses. The results from each are shown in the table below. If the associated margin of error was calculated the same way for both samples, which of the following is the most likely reason that the result for sample A has a larger margin of error? Because A is 3%. By the way, a margin of error of 3% means this could be off by 3%. So it could be 21 plus 3, which is 24, or it could be 21 minus 3, which is 18. Likewise here, the margin of error means it could be 2 below, which is 19, or 2 above, which is 23. So if the range in sample B is a little bit narrower than the range in sample A, then that tells you that sample B is somehow more accurate. And on the SAT, the only thing you have to know is that what determines the margin of error is how big the sample is. So if sample B is a little bit more precise because it has a smaller margin of error, sample B probably was bigger than sample A. That's the only thing you have to know. So sample A included more visitors than B, that's the opposite. B included more than A, that's exactly what we just said. C, sample A included a greater percentage of visitors who were wearing eyeglasses than sample B. That would be weird because if it had a greater percentage than B, then Y is the percentage the same. So C is just off. D, sample B included a greater percentage of visitors who were wearing eyeglasses than sample A. So C and D are wrong for the same reasons, and the best choice is B. Question 31, a limestone stalactite grew in length at a rate of 1/8 a millimeter per year. At this rate, how many years would it take to grow 4 millimeters? So the slightly confusing thing about this is we have to assume that it started at 0, because I think that's how stalactites grow. So the easiest way to do this is if the total was 4 millimeters and it's growing 1/8 per year, just do 4 divided by 1/8. You know that's 4 times 8, so it's going to be 32. I like to simplify my complex fractions by taking the least common denominator of top and bottom. Why? Because when I multiply by 8, top and bottom, the 8's divide out, and so 4 times 8 becomes 32. Question 32, we've got a system of equations, and they want to know what is the value of 2x. So what's nice about this is you can see that if we just add the equations together, we're going to get 2x, y plus negative y is 0, and 10 plus 4 is 14. 2x is equal to 14. You don't have to do any more work. Question 33, we've got an equation. What is the value of x minus 3? Since x minus 3 is in the radical, we're going to have to square both sides eventually, but let's get all the other numbers to the other side. We're going to subtract 10 from both sides, so we get 3 times rad x minus 3 equals 12. Divide by 3 on both sides. Rad x minus 3 equals 4. Now we can square both sides safely or easily. X minus 3 equals 16. And since they want x minus 3, we can just stop there at 16. 34. The table gives the average speed s in miles per hour of each lap around the track for one racing team. For how many laps was the average speed greater than or equal to 150? So notice these are all ranges, and since we're including 150 on the lower end, then it's really these three categories right here, because it starts at 150, goes all the way up to right under 165. Since each one tells us the number of laps, you basically add up 57 plus 52 plus 35, and that's going to give you 144 if you do it on your calculator. So very easy problem. Question 35, we've got this chart. It says Aditi and Bella each attempted the long jump 5 times during a track meet, and their distances are shown in the table. The mean distance for Bella's attempt was 0.3 greater than the mean distance for Aditi's attempts. What is the value of x? So this is basically a calculation problem. We need to figure out the average for each of them, and we do have enough information to figure out x, so let's do the easier one first, Aditi. So you're just going to have to add this up on your calculator. 4.2 plus 3.8 plus 3.2, all that. That's going to give you a sum of 19.5. On the bottom, we add these up, we're going to get 16.5 plus x, because we don't know what that is. Now we can calculate Aditi's average. It's basically 19.5 divided by 5. That's going to give us 3.9. And for Bella's average, it's going to be 16.5 plus x, all divided by 5. Now, what do we know about Bella's average? It says it was 0.3 greater than Aditi's. So 3.9 plus 0.3 is going to give you 4.2. Now we have an equation with only one unknown, and we can solve for x. So multiply both sides by 5. 16.5 plus x, that's going to give you 21 on the right. Subtract 16.5 from both sides, we get 4.5, and that's the missing number right here, 4.5, and that's going to be the answer to the problem. 36, what is the x-coordinate of the x-intercept of the line with equation blah 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 when it's graphed? Okay, so the x-intercept is basically where the line crosses the x-axis, and the y-coordinate at that point is going to be 0. So all we have to do is substitute 0 for y, solve for x, and then we'll get it. So 5/4 x plus 2/3 of 0 is 0 equals 1. And now we basically just have to solve for x. So multiply both sides by 4 over 5. So x equals 4/5. This tells us that when y is equal to 0, x is equal to 4/5. So the coordinate that we have is 4/5 comma 0. That's the x-intercept, and they want the x-coordinate of that, so the answer is obviously going to be 4/5, similar to 4.5 on number 35. 37. What is the perimeter of an equilateral triangle with a height of 5 rad 3? So if you've memorized what I told you guys to memorize about triangles, this is actually very easy. When you divide an equilateral triangle in half with an altitude or an angle bisector, this is 5 rad 3. What you get is two 30, 60, 90 triangles. And if you remember your proportions of a 30, 60, 90 triangle, this is the long leg. To get from the long leg to the short leg, you divide by rad 3, so that's 5. To get to the short leg to the hypotenuse, you multiply by 2, and that's 10. Because basically I remember that a 30, 60, 90 triangle has proportions 1, rad 3, and 2. And so, what's the equilateral triangle? If all three sides are 10, then the perimeter is going to be 30. And that's really all you have to do. Question 38. In the system of equations shown, a is a positive constant. For which value of a does the system have exactly one distinct real solution? So even though on the SAT, most of the time it likes combination, what I'm actually going to do here is substitution. Since these things are both equal to y, what I'm going to do is set them equal to each other. So negative 3 equals x squared plus 10x plus a. By the way, the math would have been the same if you had just subtracted one from the other to eliminate the y's. So we're going to add 3 to both sides, x squared plus 10x plus a plus 3. I'm putting parentheses around that because that's still my c term. That's still the constant. And now notice what they're asking for. They want to know for what value of a does the system have one distinct real solution. So how do we know if there are multiple or one solutions for a quadratic equation? We use the discriminant, which is b squared minus 4ac. And remember, if we want one real solution, b squared minus 4ac has to be equal to 0. So we're going to plug this in, and b is 10, so it's going to be 100 minus 4, a is 1. C, by the way, is a plus 3. If we plug that in, all that equals 0. So this becomes 100 minus 4a minus 12 equals 0. And we'll add 4a to both sides. And then this is 100 minus 12 is 88. Divide by 4 on both sides, we get a equals 22. So that's going to be the answer. And real quick, just remember, if the discriminant b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, you've got two real roots. If it's equal to 0, you have one real root. And if it's less than 0, you've got two imaginary roots. And I explained that in one of my math lesson videos. But just real quick, this is what you should have memorized for this problem.